Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which is wrapped in so many layers of turbulence, consequential change. It's hard to keep track. Just, I'm not even going to go through the list. It's long and it can create paralysis and confusion. And what I try to do on Sustain What is cut through some particular question in a way that leads to something other than more questions. And today I'm really pleased to talk about food and land, and with two of my favorite writers who focus deeply on issues related to what's on your plate and where it comes from and where we go from here. Michael Grunwald, congratulations on a masterful new book out. These books, this one I think you said took 5 years to work, so it's just extraordinary uh, achievement to pull that together, having struggled with that practice before. And Tamar, good to see you here again. Last time we were here, we were talking with Ruth DeFries about similar issues,
Yes, we
the
were.
big ratchet. And so here we're going to talk about Michael's. We're going to focus on Michael's book, but on the also on just these big issues related to how we eat our way through this century without wrecking the planet that we live on. As I said, first of all, congratulations. It's a really good read. I'm still digging in. This is not a 1 day book. It's a and
It's a beach read.
I read it in one sitting.
You did. Were you eating something at the same time? And Michael, I wanted to start with you bit off a big thing to chew on here. There's so many components of this question. Do you have a way? I hate this idea of elevator pitches or summaries, but what do you say to someone if you're running into someone consequential and what's the takeaway? 2 or 3 points would be great.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for the kind words. This was a slog to get it done. So it's this is the fun part when people say nice things. So thank you. The title is "We Are Eating the Earth." And I guess part of what I say to people is that, agriculture is eating the earth. It is now 2 of every 5 acres of the planet, while cities and suburbs are like 1 of every 100 acres. So this natural planet has become an agricultural planet. We are losing a soccer field worth of tropical forest every 6 seconds, and we are losing it to agriculture. So that in a way is the elevator pitch. Food is a third of our climate problem, but it's like 3% of our climate finance, and I think like maybe 0.3% of our climate conversation. So I wrote the book to kind of wave my hands in the air and say, hey, this stuff is a really big deal. We need to grapple with it. And, I'm sure there will be a lot of people who don't like various things about my book, but it grapples.
Yeah, and I'm going to bring up the notion of the complexity monster, which I've written about before, that stalks climate policy, and it's certainly within the food component. Just talking about climate, because we'll just get right into it. We're going to dive through not all the chapters here for sure, but I pulled out a couple themes that really I feel deserve some time and attention. But maybe you could just sort of scan here the sections just so people understand the key components briefly.
A brief overview of
yeah, but not really. You're talking about
global agriculture and its impact.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, what I will say is, if you see the guy who figures stuff out, that's the main character of my book, is a guy named Tim Searchinger, who is is an analyst. I mean, he started as a lawyer, and now he's a scientist who's published 10 articles in Science and Nature, the 2 most prestigious journals, which is more than a lot of academic departments. But basically, he's a guy who, he is a figure outer, a sort of brilliant, relentless, fact-based dude who has a welcome mat at his house that says no dogmas. And so he has pissed a lot of people off over the years. But what he essentially figures out is this land problem. He figures it out through biofuels, which were once seen as this sort of great climate solution. And the sort of long story short is that Tim, who was then just a lawyer, started looking at the climate analyses and realized that they were not considering the land use costs of biofuels, that when you grow fuel instead of food, you have to grow food somewhere else, and it's probably going to be in a forest or a wetland that was storing a lot of carbon. And so he sort of realizes that biofuels are a climate disaster because of all their land use, because they're eating the earth. And then the second half of the book, he realizes that, biofuels are eating about a Texas worth of the earth, but livestock are eating 50 Texas's worth of the earth, and agriculture is eating 75 Texas's worth of the earth. So he comes up with this kind of blueprint for various ways people could try to solve these problems. And I then went sort of trying to chase these solutions down and see if any of them are working. So is that the quick description?
Yeah. And it gets at the idea of finding that narrative thread with a particular person. And there's sections on organic, on there's sections on technology, the alt meat, and ultimately you come away with a sense of pathways. And we're going to talk about the pathways at the end. Now, I want to ask each of you, who comes to mind who could play a similar role in sort of looking at the thread of understanding of the global challenge of feeding everyone on this planet as we head through 9 billion people to whatever comes next. I don't know, Michael, who else were you thinking about? When you were cogitating about putting the book together, there are other people like Tim. What made him special? And then tomorrow, I want to ask you about people who you followed through this whole saga too.
Well, I will tell a little story, which, my book proposal, which, and I know this is going to be really shocking to people, but there was not it was not met with wild enthusiasm by, the auction was extremely disappointing. Even the Simon & Schuster, like a high ranking executive there who I won't name, said that instead I should write a book about impossible foods. And I knew one of the people who didn't bid, the CEO of another publishing house. And I talked to him afterwards and I was like, well, why weren't you interested in this book? And he made a few excuses, but then ultimately I was like, well, how could the proposal have been better? And he said, too much Holocaust, not enough Anne Frank. Which was a kind of creepy, macabre way of saying that we don't just want to read about the problem. We need a character to follow us through, and Tim is the perfect character, just because he was sort of the first guy on this land use problem, and then he wrote the World Resources Institute report, creating a sustainable food future, which was at the time, this was 2019. At the time, there was really no blueprint that sort of laid out this problem and any solutions to try to solve it. And so he did that. So he was kind of the problem guy and the solution guy. And he was, I hope it comes across in the pages, he's a kind of fun, interesting character. I think he's probably not entirely thrilled with everything I said about him, because he's kind of a pain in the ass, and he's
I know.
suffer fools gladly, and
we all know Tim.
But in any case, so I didn't really there weren't a lot of other people who are thinking about who have that kind of role. There are people like that in energy, but in food, I think he's the guy.
And Tamar, does anyone who have you tracked through the years on these issues?
So I'm not going to answer the question. I'm instead going to reframe the thing.
Yeah.
Because I think that Mike's book sort of illustrates one of the problems of food related discourse, and why it's hard to point to, this person is doing, this marvelous work that's going to get us to the end of the tunnel. And there's factions in food, and it's complicated, and they're not clear borders, but they roughly break down to, the people who are really looking at regenerative agroecology, organic solutions, putting carbon back in the soil. And there's some ideas that come out of that I think are good and worthwhile and true. And then you have the technology people who are interested in genetic modification and fake meat. and using technology to try and solve this problem. And they cannot get along.
No.
And like the initial parts of Mike's book really illustrate this, how Tim takes this idea about land, that land is important, and he goes into the Shark Tank with all these people who are committed to the idea of biofuels because they think it's going to save the planet. And you end up with a fight on your hands. And it took him a long time and a lot of fighting to sort of get to some kind of consensus on biofuels. But food is, in general, it's so messy, it's so big, it so appeals to our instinct that says it should be natural rather than technological.
Right.
And so I actually think that the factions in food, the teams, are in some ways preventing a clear and agreed upon way forward.
Does that resonate with you, Michael?
It does. And in fact, I write about these kind of silos. And in fact, one of my hopes from this book is that, I do suggest that these different, parts of food world have things they can learn from each other. I think the best example is when I went to Brazil and visited those cattle ranches, where, in Brazil, you have these terribly degraded ranches where you have like one cow for every 10 acres. It's a terrible waste of land, and it's really destroying the Amazon and the Cerrado. But then we saw some incredibly productive ranches. And what was interesting is, there had been some investment, and we met, and these guys that, they had not read Michael Pollan, but so it was a mix.
There's somebody out there who hasn't read Michael Pollan?
Yeah, exactly. These are like, they weren't they weren't singing like Jason Mraz folk songs about the soil. But they were doing a lot of regenerative practices. They had no-till, they had cover crops. They were integrating their cattle with their crops. They were doing the rotational grazing, the kind of some of the stuff that Alan Savory likes. And essentially, in many ways, the kind of things that Michael Pollan would have recognized. Of course, they also had feedlots, and they were fertilizing their pastures in ways that Michael Pollan would have been like, "Oh, what are you doing?" But the fact was, they weren't doing it because of any ideology. They were doing it because they had kick-ass yields. They had one cow for every acre. So, they were using 1/10 as much of the Amazon and the Cerrado. And so I think the different practices, I certainly tried not to be prescriptive, like, oh, you got to do it in industrial way or an organic way, but certainly one message is that you've got to be thinking about the productivity and efficiency and the land use, that is important, that we need to make more food with less acres, because otherwise you're going to need more acres to make food. And that is certainly a theme that I think Tim has, Tim is not the guy saying like farm like this or farm like that, but he is the guy saying like yields matter, productivity matters because land matters.
Yeah, and you're getting at a key point that I followed for a long time, which is intensification matters, getting more from the same amount of land. The problem there you come up with, and this is not just related to food, but even suburban expansion. I remember 20 years ago writing about Florida. Oh, it was not the Rockefeller Foundation, MacArthur Foundation. A lot of that money for the MacArthur Foundation came from Florida real estate, and they were selling off real estate, to get the benefit for the financing. But Florida had very little disincentive for expansion. I mean, you wrote your swampland,
My first book was about the Everglades, and I am a Florida man.
As long as you don't have policy or zoning or other restrictions, the spreadology, the norm for spreading.
Well, and this
is just there, and it's the same. I was in the Amazon in 1989 writing my book, The Burning Season, and I was back in Belém last year, speaking with journalists there, and learned a lot about exactly what you're talking. What's in the book about this, the potential for that, but it also needs governance, and it needs policing, and it needs regulatory stuff. And I know you both dealt with that issue too. It's not we're going to expand without rules,
right? But I mean, the first point, right? Like as I said, agricultural sprawl is 40 times the size of urban sprawl. So you got to start with that, right? And we all kind of know it. Like when we take those cross-country flights and we see all those squares and circles, we can see that that agriculture is kind of, taking over. But we don't really, we haven't really we don't feel it in our bones. And so that is part of the Tim story, this idea that land is not free, this idea that every acre is sacred. The idea is that people should try to feel that in their bones, and that, as a starting point, we need to value the land, not just sort of metaphorically, but actually in our analyses, our climate analyses, we need to put a value on it. Those ranches that I just talked about that are using 1/10 of as much of the Amazon, if they wanted to go to the carbon markets, the smartest thing they could do if the owner wanted to get paid would be to redegrade his ranch and turn it into a crappy ranch with one cow on every 10 acres again, because then he would have fewer cows, so less methane, and he would not be fertilizing his pastures, so he would have less nitrous oxide emissions. But of course, he gets no credit for the fact that he'd be, or he wouldn't be penalized in this case for the fact that he would be using 10 times as much land per calorie. And because they are not putting a value on the land we use. And so this is what I bang my spoon in my high chair about over and over again, is this idea that until we actually pay attention to, this limited land that we have on the planet, right? Some Mark Twain said they ain't making any more of it. And until we value it, like, this is what we need to make our food. This is what we need to store our carbon. And the idea that we're continuing to, trying to decarbonize the planet while we continue to steamroll these forests and wetlands, it's like trying to clean your house while you smash the vacuum cleaner to bits in the living room, because you're making a huge mess and you're crippling your ability to clean up the mess. And so that is the kind of, to the extent there's a big idea here, that's it. And then the other stuff is, what are the practical, technological, behavioral, and political solutions that we can do to try to deal with this sustainable intensification problem, both on the demand side and the supply side. But you got to start from this notion that the land matters and that we got to value it.
And, in my experience, this has been something that is hard. It's a hard argument to make persuasive pithily, because it's intangible. And so people totally understand fossil fuels, they totally understand emissions, but this idea that if you use this agricultural land for something that either yields no food like biofuels or yields less food like organic agriculture, you have to make this up someplace else. And it doesn't, because of course there's lots of moving parts in agriculture. And so, well, what if we grow it here and it's cheaper and that changes the import-export ratio? I mean, there's not going to be a precise one-to-one correlation between the land we use for biofuels and the new land we break. But the general idea that if you're not using this land for food, or you're using it for less food, eventually we're going to need more land someplace else. But it's not compelling to people. They don't like this argument. It's a really tough one, and I've been trying to make it for a long time. And hell, if I can't make the argument, nobody can make the argument. Yeah. But I think Mike's taking a really good shot at it here.
Well, you put the argument in big letters on an orange cover, and and with a pithy little line like that, and you hope that at least that one idea can kind of can catch hold, right? I don't know. When they did the cover, they had one very classy cover. And then they had this one.
And they're like, no, classy and groove all just don't go together.
But I would think it was like too sensationalist or too like, look at me. And I was like, no, the look at me one. That's good. I like that.
Yeah, there it is again. Yeah. What you talk about supply and demand, and even there's levels of complexity. When someone looks at their plate or they go to the market in America, they still don't have any clue where their food's coming from, right? Unless they're smart enough or motivated enough to use the QR code things that I think it was Glickman, one of the secretaries of agriculture, was pushing for more information for the consumer being something that can then relate to markets and policy and how businesses work and stuff. And then you have the supplies, which, as someone just said here in the comments, Scott Lewis says, how do the poorly managed farms in Brazil survive economically? I mean, they are still part of the supply. So how much of this do you think is consumer choice driven? And then let's just talk about Western consumers, because then there's the whole China question. But just talking about Western consumers, Tamar, you deal with this all the time in terms of your audience. Does it really matter that people should be more enterprising and understand where their shrimp come from, or their meat, etc.?
No, I think that if you're a consumer, there's almost no way you can know enough about the specifics of how your food was grown to know whether one kind of shrimp, and I'm going to make a caveat for a few things that I think, you just maybe shouldn't buy at all. But for the most part, you can't know the specifics of how your food was grown in any kind of granular way. I mean, I farm oysters, which has been one of the products. Well, I used to farm oysters. Now I'm too old. Farming oysters is like farming rocks. You just move heavy things around. And my husband and I have aged out of that cohort. And so, but I did it for a long time. And you can talk about how oysters are grown till the cows come home. But until you actually run a farm, you don't have any really good idea about the ins and outs. And of course, you can know a little bit, but if you're a consumer, the things that you can do are looking at the food categories. So if you eat less beef, then that's the number one thing you can do, because beef is by far and away has the biggest impact on the climate. You can eat less beef and waste less food. And those are the two biggies. And that's much more important.
You're stealing my lines, man.
Oh, sorry about that. Hey, I thought it was my line. All of our lines have gotten jumbled.
It's one line.
So
Tamar is correct.
If you do those two things, then everything else is just, peripheral.
That's right.
Yeah, no, there's a big chunk of the book on beef. And Mike, can you kind of weigh in a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. I mean, those are the two biggies, and those are the ones I say. And in fact, in my diet, I have cut out beef and lamb because the ruminant meats are the baddies. Obviously, for instance, dairy is a problem too, but because cattle are so bad and they're such inefficient converters of their feed into our food, but cows produce milk multiple times a day, while they only produce beef once. And so really, at least 25, could in some cases a lot more. You need to put 25 calories into a cow to get a calorie of beef out of it. And so it is true, the burping and farting, methane is a real problem, even if it sounds goofy. The manure, which has also some methane and nitrous oxide, and gets dumped in bad places, also a problem. But the main thing is cattle use too much land. I mean, 2/3 of all agricultural land is pasture, and that doesn't include the crops that are fed to cows. So they are just, it takes a lot of energy from their feed to support all those hooves and their tails and their breathing and their pooping and their reproductive systems and all kinds of stuff that does not make meat. And it turns out that actually feedlot beef are even more efficient and therefore better for the climate and the planet than the lovely organic grass-fed beef that you hear so much about.
But I think we should address the organic grass-fed beef, because as soon as you start having this discussion, ask me how I know, somebody pops up and says, but the cattle I eat are grazing on land that can't be used for crops. They're turning, 25 calories, but it's 25 calories of grass into 1 calorie of high quality human food. And I think that's the picture that people struggle with. That, how can this be bad if we're growing quality food on crappy land, converting things that humans can't eat into food that humans can eat?
Well, let me just first say that about 40% of all grazing land around the planet was former forest land.
Right.
And so, if we were just going to start by getting rid of cows on that land and reforesting it, we could probably come to a nice conclusion. But one of the points that this is, some of Searchinger's work has pointed out is that even the pure grasslands, that has an opportunity cost too, the transforming that into grazing land. And look, yes, I know there were wild ruminants on the plains, but the way modern grazing works is usually quite different. I do think this is, if we're going to keep whacking Michael Pollan around again, and he's such a beautiful writer that in some ways his ideas have, I think he's convinced some people of some wrong things, but he has this notion that there's kind of good, kinder and gentler, more natural agriculture, that where you kind of the cow, the cows by name, and you have diverse crops, and it's like EIEIO, and then that's been transformed into this kind of evil, nasty industrial agriculture with these chemical drenched monocultures, and where all the cows are stuffed into these terrible feedlots. And that's sort of bad agriculture, and we need to go back to the good agriculture. But one of the real lessons is that there is an environmental cost of intensification. I mean, you see it in the Gulf of Mexico. Absolutely. Where you've got a dead zone created by fertilizers from the Mississippi Valley. You see it with pesticides have problems. Large scale irrigation has some problems. There are all kinds of problems, antibiotics, you name it. The politics of most of these big ag agencies really suck. I get it. But the real environmental disaster was the transformation of nature into the nice Michael Pollan, rustic, bucolic, pastoral farms and pastures. That's really, it was the plains, the middle of this country was once it was like America's Serengeti, and that doesn't exist anymore. And, Indiana was 85% forest, and now it's corn and soybeans. So we don't think about that anymore. But that's when we lost the carbon. That's when we lost the biodiversity. And that's a different way of thinking for people, that again, maybe by putting it in a bright orange cover, people will get it, and telling hopefully fun stories throughout the book that kind of makes the medicine go down. But that is the medicine that I'm trying to force down people's throats. This idea that it's the transformation of a natural planet into an agricultural planet, while necessary in some senses to feed people because we got to eat, but there is a cost to it, and we have to be aware of the costs, and we have to try to minimize the costs.
Yeah, and boy, the path from at that level of centuries, the path from what happened in the Midwest to now, and a lot of afforestation happened in the Northeast,
right.
For example. A huge amount of forest came back, but going from here forward, it feels like it's a hard road. I'm going to show very briefly. I love this map of the historic range of bison, which goes through Chicago. So just think of those millions of bison that used to roam, going through areas that are now completely humanized. And it's not like, unless the depopulation people win, then we're never going to that again.
But we shouldn't over romanticize the 18th century, bison roaming wild either, because by that time, by 1800, early agriculturalists, this is before the Industrial Revolution, they had already transformed a South America worth of the planet from forest to from forest and prairie into agricultural land. So again, there's this notion that like once things were, we were not. When things stopped being natural was with the invention of agriculture 10 to 12,000 years ago. And you can actually see in the ice cores and the ancient pollen samples, you can see measurable global warming from those early agriculturalists. And this is the kind of macabre story that I sometimes tell. But actually, after the Great Dying in the United States, after European contact, when indigenous peoples, not in the just in all of the Americas, indigenous people were wiped out by genocide or disease, there was actually noticeable global cooling because they were very sophisticated farmers, and their land turned back to nature after they died out. So again, I feel like I try not to romanticize early agriculture because agriculture always makes a mess. It has since it began, and the challenge is just to have it make less of a mess.
Yeah, and we'll get to the some of the prescriptions and your focus on industrial factory style production in a minute. I want to get to some questions. There's some good ones. And let's see. Whoops, I just was going to show something. Someone did bring up lamb, and then, but the bigger question, which you actually just talked about, you're off of lamb.
I'm
Should
not
they
off
eat
of lamb.
It's not quite as bad as beef, but it's really cutting out beef and lamb is about as good as going vegetarian, because most vegetarians end up eating more dairy. So
basically, the reason lamb isn't as big a problem is fewer people eat it.
Yeah, but even for it's not quite as bad. They're not as large, and there's sort of a better meat to body ratio, but it's not great.
I'm showing George Steinmetz, my co-author and friend, who's done an incredible job of tracking food production impacts on the earth. What we're looking at here is sheep, and it's a lot of animals in a very confined space. And that brings me to Zoe Weil, who I've had on the show before. Zoe is here in Maine. She runs the Institute for Humane Education. She's a vegan. And she says, if you eat less, so this gets to the ethical question. This isn't just about climate. It's not, if we're just thinking about climate, we're not thinking about the full scope of what's going on. And she talks about if you eat less beef, but switch to poultry fish, the level of animal cruelty suffering increases exponentially. Do you encourage veganism?
So this is a great question. And first of all, like going vegan is the best diet for not only for the animals, but for the planet and the climate. And I do encourage it, but I don't practice it because I'm weak. And I feel like we all kind of find the kind of level of hypocrisy that we're comfortable with. And this has been a criticism of some of my work, that I sort of focus on the planet and the climate at the expense of animals. And I think it's kind of a fair criticism. I do try to point out that, that the eating of the earth has had a devastating effect on wild animals, that now our livestock outweigh wild animals by 30 to 1. And so I am sort of trying to be a voice also for nature, and that includes the critters that live in nature. But it's absolutely a fair question, and there are trade-offs. I mean, to the extent that we can adopt, we'll talk about solutions, but if we all, to the extent we can adopt meat substitutes and reduce meat in our diets, have more plant-forward diets, that's going to be good for animals as well as the climate. But yes, I talk about that I'm sort of with the cows in the Chick-fil-A billboards who say eat more chicken. But chickens it sucks for the chickens because they are treated way worse than cows. Pigs are treated badly too. I visited a pig farm.
Oh my God.
And the guy who owned it said that he treated his pigs better than his kids. And I was like, except for that part at the end. he was like, yeah, we omit that with our kids. But honestly, even the part in the middle, I was looking at those pigs and they do not have a lot of room to stretch out and move around. And it's terrible. So you see like something like what California did, which essentially is passing a law to say that, the pigs do need a little bit more room to move around. I'm good with that. And I'm friends with the guy who is behind that, Josh Balk. And what I would say is we just need to be aware of the trade-offs, right? Those pigs, because they move around more, they are going to use more energy and therefore need more food and ultimately take up more land. And there is going to be a trade-off there. I think I would say that, like, to treat pigs a little less obscenely, that's probably worth it. But so I think, people who focus on people who are vegan, that's great. And people who focus on animal cruelty, I salute that as well. And hopefully we can talk about more of these solutions that are going to make both of us happy.
Yeah, let's get into that. It would be fun to have Zoe.
This isn't one of them. I can see.
Yeah, you did a much discussed column in the Times that draws heavily on the book, obviously, and gets at this idea of intensification. And so describe what you've learned from the conversation that's built around that section of the book and the piece that preceded it.
Yeah, well, look, I didn't write that headline. And again, what I've tried to, and even in that piece, there were, I stand by every word that I wrote in that piece, but there were other words that I wanted to write that didn't make it in that I wish had, which were partly that I think there are alternative ways of doing it, like alternative meat would be a great example that solves both problems. And I would like to see, right now, I write in the book about the kind of boom and then subsequent bust of the plant-based meat industry. I write about sort of the struggles that cultivated meat made from animal cells have had. But that's an example of a kind of win-win solution that's good for animals and good for the climate and just reduces animal agriculture generally. That said, to the extent we have animal agriculture, I do believe it needs to be high yield. We need to make more meat from fewer animals and less land. And that is something that factory farms, like other factories, are really good at manufacturing lots of stuff efficiently. To the extent that regenerative agriculture, as I talked about, there's some of those practices can actually contribute to efficiency. I'm all for it. But I don't like this idea that we should just waste less food and therefore we don't need to make more food. So we can have low yield agriculture and have this sort of agroecological paradise. There, I feel like it's very important that we feed the world. There are 700 million hungry people, and we're on track to have another couple billion. I think it's, we can't just hand wave away the problem that we need more food. And yes, some of these industrial efficiency can really help.
So I'm going to make the case for pigs here, not how pigs are raised in the United States, but pigs in general, because unlike cattle, they are an excellent animal to feed human beings. And they grow incredibly quickly. They are incredibly fertile. Their feed conversion ratio is very good. And you don't have to go to extremes to raise a pig better. A pig needs some space. A pig thrives on other pigs. Pigs thrive on enriched environments. It's great if they can go outside, especially when the weather's nice. But for the most part, they can do some pasturing, but mostly pigs in grass aren't such a great match because they're monogastrics. But I think that a system, and also when you kill one, you take one life and you get a lot of meat. And, my future of food is heavy into pigs that are raised well. And as Mike said, there are trade-offs. Yes, you're going to use more resources, but I think there is a level of animal welfare below which it is immoral to go. And we have gone there. And I think we need to get back.
Mike, what do you think of that?
No, again, I think the criticisms of me for not caring enough about animal welfare are probably legit. And I do try to, I always, what I think is really important is to acknowledge the trade-offs, because this is, as Tamar always says, food is personal. It's all about trade-offs all the time. And and to me, like, I'm trying to put it like people can make their own choices. Like, we vote on these issues 3 times a day. And, hopefully you can vote an extra time by buying my book. Right. But I'm not going to tell people like how much to value, animal welfare versus, climate progress, versus how much we want farms to look like the farms of our childhood, right? They're all legitimate values. And what I'm trying to put out there is like, here is the impact that these different forms of food and these different forms of farming have on these different priorities. And then you can choose for yourself. And I think, public policy has to choose as well. Right now, there's a massive global push, and you see it on the left with Al Gore and Michael Pollan, and on the right with Bobby Kennedy and Joe Rogan, and agribusinesses like Archer Daniels Midland, and big food companies like General Mills, and and all those carbon cowboy, kiss the ground type movies, and a lot of celebrities and a lot of environmental groups, and God knows a lot of philanthropies. Everybody wants to just sort of transform farming to these, kind of nice agroecological, kinder and gentler, light on the land type farms.
And it's magical thinking.
I do think, I at least want people to say, like, I'd like to hear the argument that I want to do this because I want people to have less food and I want us to cut down more forests. If people were willing to make those arguments, I'd be like, okay, we're having an honest conversation. And I am trying to promote an honest conversation.
Yeah, this is very valuable. By the way, I'm going to get to this question from Andrew de Coriolis in a second, but I'll flashback to Zoe, who says, I'm here to help you go vegan, Michael. By the way,
Tamara's got me on lentils, so I'm
my work is done.
I'm eating more plants. I am eating more plants, but I still eat a lot of chicken.
Well, when I had Zoe on here to talk about her book, The Solutionary Way, it's all about trade-offs and discussion. She goes to a gym here, a CrossFit gym with avid hunters here in Maine, and she's found a way to work out with hunters and coming at it with a vegan.
I'm not pretending also, by the way, that it's like better for my body. I just freaking love meat. And I do say, like, like we've been, our species and our ancestors have been eating it for 2 million years. Right. And I do think we are a little bit hardwired to enjoy it. And one thing I love about the cultivated meat, as opposed to the plant-based meat, is that when I've eaten a lot of this stuff, and I find that when I do eat it, like, it's like 2 million years of evolution saying hello. It's like something goes ding in my brain. And it's like, that's meat. Even when it's only like 10% meat and 90% plants, something about having I don't know. I'm not defending, like I said, I'm a hypocrite. I'm trying to be less of a hypocrite. I think in certain ways we're all hypocrites. Like I have solar panels, I have an electric car, but I still fly too much. So I'm trying not to be scoldy. I'm not trying to tell anybody you're a bad person for not being perfect, because, I think perfect is not so much on the menu. But I do think better is better than worse, as Tamara has heard me say before. And, I think we should try to do better. So I'm trying. So great job for you. I appreciate it. And thanks for your help. You'll send me good recipes.
Yeah, she will, I'm sure. So we talk about the solution section of the book. You get into... there's a whole section on one of the things that I feel is very exciting is manufactured meat, however you want to describe it. And there are some that seem really good and some that seem not so good, and it's moving ahead with chicken. And yet these businesses keep kind of flopping. So you have a whole discussion of that. So what do you think? The scale issue is enormous too, of course, getting from point A where we at now with some real transformation. Is that a significant part of your pathway? And I'm just going to mention here, this is a piece I did in 2008 for the Times on my .earth blog about, I thought, well, start with something that's high profit. Why don't they start with foie gras? And because actually liver tissue is very proliferative, and that never went in. It's not like people went, "Oh yeah, let's follow Andy's suggestion and do that."
Well,
some people are.
I got some good news for you, Andy.
They're doing it in Australia.
They are. This company
cool.
called Vow, and they are making cultivated Japanese quail foie gras. And by the way, they are already making tons of meat every week. Tons. Now, look, the earth eats, we 350 million tons of meat every year. But this is like a few years ago, these companies were making ounces. And now they are making tons. So that's a cultivated meat. And this, I know Tamar and I, there's some daylight between us because she is more skeptical and I am more optimistic. And so far, she has been right on the investment side, but I have been right on the technological side because I have been reporting on what's happening in these companies. And there was a scientific paper in 2021 that basically said this stuff will never work because it'll never be economical. And the big example was that the media, basically the feed for the cells, the sort of glop that the cells eat from, would never get, he said, it would probably never get below $6 a liter, certainly never below $2.50 a liter, and it needs to get below $1 a liter to have any chance of being competitive. That was 2021. In 2025, a company called Clever Carnivore just announced that their media is now 7 cents a liter. And there's a company in London that's making pet food that's doing it for 2 cents a liter. So it's just a way of saying like shit happens. Like our species, not so good at being nice to each other, not so good at making great sacrifices for the planet, really good at inventing cool stuff.
So the source of my skepticism, I want to be clear about this because in a lot of ways, I do share your belief in human ingenuity. That's kind of hardwired in me. I do think that some of the problems are going to be harder to solve than you do. But my biggest issue is that, cultivated meat isn't going to be useful until it actually cuts demand from real meat, specifically beef. Because if it cuts demand for chicken or pork, it's probably not going to be much of a climate win. So it has to cut demand for beef. And the things that drive demand for the actual beef herd are the whole muscle cuts. It's people like steak. And so I think we are a long, long, long way away from a persuasive, cultivated steak. And until that happens, it's hard to see how this is going to play out. Yes, if you can have persuasive burger, then maybe that will push down the cost of actual burger, which will push up the cost of the whole muscle meats. And maybe that will reduce consumption of those, and that will reduce the size of the beef herd. I just think we are a long way away from this making a measurable impact on the climate impact of human diets.
And I'm showing an AP story, a recent one out of Florida, of course. Then there's the politics.
I was there. I was at that party.
So tell us about that party, because the resistance here is not just about practical issues or cost; it's about policy and politics. And the same thing in Brazil, and China makes its decisions based on things other than the data sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, my governor Ron DeSantis has banned cultivated meat, which was not yet for sale in Florida. But he's basically saying consumers, you can't have it. I guess this is supposed to be conservative principles, they call it the free state of Florida, but we are not free to eat these, quite delicious chicken that you see cooking in that pan. And I think it is a danger. There's no question. Look, I mean, electric cars, right? They became sort of known as Obama mobiles. And I think there's been a very concerted effort by kind of meat industry interests to portray, the cultivated meat as Biden burgers and plant-based meat too. And I think that's a danger. Like you saw that when Cracker Barrel tried to have impossible sausages, and people were like, you had the MAGA type saying like, "You'll take my pork sausages out of my cold dead hands." And of course, it was like, nobody's saying you can't have your pork sausages. It's just we're going to offer another option. What I acknowledge that this is a problem, and it's like a serious problem. We saw what happened with GMOs, where they got this sort of frankenfood reputation before they even hit the market, and that's been really problematic, because even though they've been proven to be safe, they have the scarlet letter on them, or 3 scarlet letters, I guess. What I will say though is, and here Tesla's the good example, is that if you make a better mousetrap that's actually cheaper, or at least cost competitive, some people are going to buy it. And the story of plant-based meat so far, I think, has been that the dogs didn't like the food. There got a lot of excitement at the beginning because it was better than the old kind of vegan hockey puck burgers, but it wasn't better than meat, and it wasn't cheaper than meat. And so it has not done very well in the marketplace. But that's a reason to make better, cheaper, plant-based meat in the future. And in fact, plant-based nuggets now in blind taste tests, they actually beat chicken-based nuggets. I mean, who the hell even knows what's in an actual chicken nugget, right? I mean, it's like, and it's just a vehicle for sauce anyway. But so there's really no reason to eat a chicken nugget anymore. And I think that, I can imagine that happening with burgers in the not terribly distant future. I think Tamar is exactly right that steak is going to take longer, and it's going to be harder. But there's been incredible progress, and I've tasted chicken fillets, like a whole muscle cut of chicken that was better than, not just tasted like chicken, but tasted better than chicken because it was made from the cells of a heritage chicken, as opposed to the modern industrial chickens that are bred for fast growth instead of good taste. So I do think it will take some time. I think, probably not as much time maybe as Tamar thinks, but maybe more time than I think.
Mike, I think that the subtext of what you just said is something maybe we should talk about explicitly, which is that it is unlikely that people en masse are going to make decisions about what to eat based primarily on the climate impact. People say they care about this. They do actually care about it. But when it comes down to making decisions for food for themselves and their family, they care about taste, price, convenience, and sometimes they care about their own health, but that's a distant fourth. Right. Taste, price, and convenience are it. And if people are going to switch away from meat, it's going to be because it's too expensive and they have something they like better that's cheaper. And that's really the only reason. And that is deeply human. And it's going to apply in the developing world where meat eating goes up as people are lifted out of poverty.
But remember, electric vehicles are doing it, right?
Right, exactly. That's what it's a great example.
Tesla started with a Roadster, which was like a $120,000 sports car that was like not mass market at all. That was Japanese quail foie gras, right?
And that gets me back to, I was going to say, that gets me back to the foie gras
and the idea was to get, and then you make enough of that to finance making a Model S. And then you make enough of that to finance the Model 3. Right. And suddenly you've got a the biggest selling sedan in the world. And so, until it got beaten by a cheaper one that they made in China. So again, I think, this is the path. And I don't think it's a dead end. I think it's going to really matter whether in 10 years or 15 years, 10% of the market or 20% of the market or 2% of the market. That's really important, right? Like alternative milk is already 15% of the market in the US, and that's great. But people are eating more cheese. These are going to be very difficult problems to solve. But we got to start trying to solve them. And again, I would also point out that with electric vehicles, there was a lot of help from the government on the R&D stuff. And then once you found some R&D that worked on the deploy. And we have not yet seen that. We're just starting to see tidbits of it on the food side. And I think it's going to be really important. We need moonshots there too.
By the way, I want to quickly ask if you can go just beyond the turn of the hour, Michael, or do you have stuff lined up?
Absolutely.
Good. Because we didn't talk about organic. You did talk about sort of the, carbon cowboys and regenerative ag having such a hype around it. The book has this section on Sri Lanka, as the kind of worst case nightmare scenario for organic. But also the flip side rejections of like golden rice, etc. This is not just a U.S. elite organic Europe thing. So, is this less significant than we think in terms of making the transition that you're describing with these other forms of food that can come forward just through price, convenience, etc.?
You mean the politics?
Yeah, do you have to overcome something here?
This is a good example of how like politics can really screw things up, right? I mean,
sure.
This guy banned agrochemicals and he destroyed his nation's agricultural system, and he got run out of the country on a rail.
It happened fast too.
And it's like right away, because it turns out that like people don't like these nasty, toxic pesticides and evil chemical fertilizers, but the pesticides are pretty good at killing pests, and the fertilizers actually help crops grow. And if you don't have them, some bad things can happen. And I know there were some problems with the way they did it in Sri Lanka, and people are like, oh, it's a little bit like the people who talk about communism, like, it was just never really tried. Well, they certainly tried something in Sri Lanka and it didn't work. And I think in Europe, they're talking about mandating 25% organic agriculture, which is, to me, that's just basically mandating a sort of outsourcing of a lot of their food production, their deforestation, their pollution to developing countries that maybe won't do it as efficiently. So yeah, I think the politics of this stuff really matter. And it matters on the meat side too. Where I don't know if I mentioned, but I mean, I talked to a pollster who said that like restrictions and taxes on meat, which is one way that you could try to reduce that beef herd. He said it's the least popular policy of any kind that he's ever polled. He said it's like up there with veterans benefits for ISIS. So which is all a way of saying that this stuff is hard. If it were easy, somebody would have already fixed it. And we just have to really start, all the cliches, roll up our sleeves, nose to the grindstone, try and fix this shit, because now we are not even trying.
And the economic point, Mike, that you just made, it holds for the organic business as well, because the reason organic farms are successful and profitable, and they're more profitable in the United States than conventional farms, is that people can get a premium for organic food. So you can find your customer, generally an affluent customer, who is willing to pay more for organic food. And that's why the sector succeeds. And as soon as you start mandating that everybody do it, or that 25% of it, or that more people just decide to get into it because they can get the price premium, then all of a sudden there's price competition, and that price premium erodes or disappears, and then nobody's going to go organic.
Right. Also, they might realize it's not healthier, right?
Right. But if you mandate it, you're mandating this more expensive kind of production, which is going to raise food prices for everybody. So it's basically a non-starter, but it's like what Mike was talking about, this whole idea that, okay, well, we do the best we can and we muddle through. People hate that. They want ringing moral clarity, veganism, organic, regenerative. They want to be able to hang their hat on something that's a solution. And man, I do too, but we don't have that. So we have to be okay with rolling up our sleeves, muddling through, finding a little bit here and a little bit there, and doing better.
Yeah, that I'll put in a plug because I loved it. And but David Vondrelli had a piece about my book in the Washington Post today that was the message, and he described it better than I do. But it was really this notion, and I do say that, like, we're not going to have like the war on carbon is not going to end with a kind of like, ceremony on the battleship where we declare victory. This is going to be this kind of like constant struggle where, we didn't make it to 1 point. We blew past 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. But hey, like 1.6 would be better than 1.65. And that is this notion that I really do try to talk about, that all emissions matter, including individual emissions. I hate it when environmentalists now are sort of talking about how, like, we should stop talking about personal behavior and personal carbon footprint. That's just what the greenwashing corporations want. I think everybody's emissions matter. If we take this seriously as a crisis, then we can't say that, like, except for personal emissions, individual emissions, they don't count. I really think we got to try to do better everywhere.
Yeah, for sure. And markets are shaped by people's interests, and people's interests shape markets. And if you as a consumer are not pushing for more information about where your food comes from, you're not going to be provided with it automatically.
There's also a divide on sort of institutional versus personal responsibility on these things. And I think when you're talking about reducing fossil fuel use, you are often talking about institutional responsibilities, because what powers the grid is a state decision.
Right.
All kinds of energy related decisions are made at the state level. But the thing about food is, and we talked about this we hit on this in a couple of ways, that people make their own food decisions, and it's really hard to get people to eat differently when you're trying to save the planet. And so in food, it may be a different balance of personal versus institutional responsibilities than it is in energy.
Yeah. There's one last sort of micro question from Zoe. Do you support ending subsidies that make meat, dairy less expensive than what its cost would be without taxpayers footing so much of the bill?
Yeah.
You mentioned the taxes being anathema.
Yeah, well, I do. One example that I do mention in the book is the public grazing lands. The way the United States gives them away for absolutely outrageous, they give them away to ranchers. And gosh, I'm going to mess it up, but it was like, it's far below the cost of maintaining the land. And they were paying ranchers basically for like what they were paying to basically graze their cows on an acre of land is less than what I pay every day to feed my dogs. And I think there's all those herds eat a little more than my dogs. And that's a perfect example of, but also, if we're going to be honest, like, you could take away all those subsidies tomorrow and it wouldn't have a super meaningful effect on the price of beef.
And also, beef is globally traded, and I'm certainly in favor of not subsidizing it, but there's some misconceptions about how subsidies work, and very few out subsidies actually go to beef.
Right. There's this Michael Pollan belief that if we stopped subsidizing corn, then somehow the middle of the country would suddenly, be these diverse forms of, kind of multi, the kind of old style farms. And the fact is, like, corn is super efficient. Soybeans are super efficient. That's why they grow a lot of them and export a lot of them. And we should stop putting it in our cars. But you could take that away too, and they would still grow corn and soybeans.
Absolutely. So this has been a great discussion. The last point that I want to get at in the book is a section. It's right in the beginning of the book. You talk about the danger of fatalism, and which relates to the complexity monster and having a many dimension issue. So how do you convey to people, especially in the climate community where you have this whole doomist culture now? It's really a movement. A movement for paralysis, a movement for doing nothing, in a way. So how do you grapple with that?
No, it's a line
from your book.
It's a great question, because I kind of went in this very determined not to be a Debbie Downer about it. And then I wrote, and it's like very exciting writing about all these really dozens of exciting solutions, most of which we haven't talked about, right? Like, biological nitrification inhibition.
Pangamia.
Right. It makes me really, exactly. It is like this incredible super tree called Pangamia that can have like 10 times the yields of soybeans and store carbon and can be on crappy land. And, these guys at the University of Illinois who are reinventing photosynthesis which has actually done a pretty good job keeping life on Earth going for a couple billion years, but turns out to be kind of inefficient. And they're using artificial intelligence and modern gene editing and big data to try to improve yields. I write about alternative pesticides and, that are using the mRNA technology behind the COVID vaccines to constipate potato beetles to death. There's all kinds of incredibly cool stuff. And then when I wrote my sort of final chapter, the sort of summary and policy, I realized actually none of these solutions are moving the needle yet, and neither are alternative proteins and pasture intensification in Brazil, and all these very exciting stuff. So that became like the New Yorker review of my piece sort of, of my book sort of suggested she was very Debbie Downer about it and said they'd all turn out to be duds. But what I kind of say about it is just that they haven't panned out yet, and that some of them will, or some of them need to, and we got to keep trying. I do go back to when I stumbled into this book because I wrote about energy and climate a lot, and didn't know squat about food and climate, and realized I ought to look at this. But I remember when I started writing about energy and climate, there were no solutions. There were no alternatives to fossil fuels. Wind and solar were nothing. And 20 years later, if you're building a new power plant anywhere in the world, now probably not in the United States after tomorrow, but it's going to be a wind or a solar plant. They've gotten cheap, they've gotten great. So I do think things change, and the unfathomable starts to seem inevitable really fast, is definitely one of the themes of this book, but it isn't going to happen by itself. So we do have to work on it. So I do quote Searchinger sort of talking about how, sometimes he's wants to advise his colleagues to euthanize their children. But then he sees these incredibly smart people working on incredibly exciting solutions, and he feels a little better about the world. And that's really how I feel too. We're not going to find perfect solutions, but we can make things better. We're pretty good at that.
Well, it's great that you're on Substack now too. Maybe you can parse out do a string on the solutions parts of the book.
Before we end everything, I have to say that I have to plug Mike's book because, all right, we've talked all about the substance, but Mike's actually a really good writer, and he tells a really good story. And on top of everything else, this is a whirlwind tour of global agriculture, and it will give you a sense of how we feed the world, even if you don't necessarily agree with him on how or whether these solutions are going to play out. And it's just intensely readable. It's a terrific book.
Oh, man.
There you go. Boy.
By the way, to boldly grow is all.
Yes, I agree.
That's old news.
And actually, I think tomorrow night we'll stay on for 15 minutes.
Yeah. Having moved to Maine, I do some clamming off of our shore here, and it's hard work. Anyone who thinks that.
All right. So, Andy, I have to tell you, on Cape Cod, they do a clamming for kids class. Yeah. And so, of course, the week before, they seed the whole area with lots of clams, so it's easy for the kids to take them up. And the local tip is you go clamming on the clamming for kids class day. Oh, and you go around the periphery and you feel like the creepy guy at the playground, but you get a lot of clams.
Oh, wow. Well, anyway, I hope everyone out there who watches this, first of all, share this when we're done. Whatever link you're watching on can be shared. It's archived video right away. And it's on my revkin.substack.com thing already. I'm going to update that post with lots of the nuggets we've just been talking about. Nuggets, including lab nuggets, which I love that stuff. I'm eager to have the salmon that's now coming out in Oregon.
It's great. I've had it.
I think that is a path for sure when you can somewhat replicate some of the qualities of the high value foods we eat. We're on a transition, and that what you said about how renewable energy options kind of parallel that slow growth, but you need the experimentation, you need the R&D, you need the demonstration and deployment of the basics, and then you can let humans be what they are, which is to try to fill people's plates with whatever's around, and making that better is a journey. It's not a destination. So thanks for being on Sustain What, both of you, Tamar Haspel and Michael Grunwald, with your new book. We are eating the earth, and we can prosper and thrive and eat less of the planet itself. That would be a great achievement. Thanks everybody
Thanks,
for
Andy.
watching.
Thanks, Andy. You're doing
Hold
great.
on, hold on just 1 second, and we'll be hold on.